The gentleman from Missouri reserve. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I would like to yield such time as the gentleman shall consume to my friend from Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank the gentleman from Texas. Look, there's something in this bill called tax credits, but they're also called refundable. So what is a refundable tax credit? It's welfare by a different name. We are going to give cash payments, checks, to people who don't even pay taxes. The hardworking constituents that I represent in Kentucky are tired of getting up at 6 a.m., driving an hour or two to work, working their hind ends off to watch their neighbors collect these checks, of which there will be more of after this bill. It's just wrong. Now, does anybody find it interesting that the Democratic leadership has not even claimed time in opposition to this bill? Why is that? Why aren't they opposed? Now, there are a few Democrats opposed. Maybe some don't think it goes far enough, or some are opposed to what they call corporate welfare in here. But by and large, the Democrats are not opposed to this because this is an expansion of the welfare state. That is what it is. So here's my concern about that. You know, is it mean to give away money? No, it's not mean. Oh, we could consider it compassionate. Until you think about the implications. Now, this tax bill, they say it's paid for. What does that mean? What does it mean when it's paid for? There's some gimmicks in here that are not going to reduce the debt. This is actually going to cost. Now, by Washington, D.C. math, it's paid for. But when you look at the debt, when you look at the national debt, it will go up as a result of this bill. Everybody in here knows it. We know these are gimmicks when you call it a pay for. This bill will increase our debt. What's that going to do? It's going to cause inflation to go up. That's going to affect everybody, including the people you're trying to give the money to for having kids. This is bad policy. I'm opposed to it, and I urge a no vote, and I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 3 minutes.
I want to give the American people an overview of the debate that's happening here today. Why are there 3 members of Congress controlling time on the floor? I thought there were only 2 parties. Nope. When it comes to spending, there's the uniparty. There is only one party. So today, that is because Republicans and Democrats have united to kick the can down the road. They wanted to control all time for debate today, but my colleague, Mr. Roy from Texas, came down here and used a parliamentary procedure so that the people who take their oath to the Constitution most seriously, the people who are most concerned about debt, the people who want to represent the good folks back home, have a voice here today because of my colleague Chip Roy, who's claimed 20 minutes in opposition. And what are we doing here today? Well, we're going to pass a CR. We're going to kick the can down the road. Is that going to solve any problems? No, it creates another crisis next week. You see, that's what they want, another crisis. They want to threaten you with the shutdown so they can get more spending. But is this a clean CR? We're told you can't add anything to it? No, it deals with student aid in this CR. Do the American people, are they concerned about student aid right now? Is that the most pressing issue to address in this spending bill? We have a crisis at the southern border. We could add one sentence to this bill that would help tremendously. Just say, none of the funds hereby appropriated may be used to disassemble border security erected by the states on our border. Put that one sentence in this continuing resolution. That would help tremendously. I am worried that we're not going to prevail today, the third group who is debating here against the uniparty. And if the other side prevails, what will happen? What will happen today, this evening, after this passes? Will we stay here and work hard for another week to get the 12 bills done, the 12 separate appropriations bills? No. Guess what we're going to do this evening? Everybody's already got their plane tickets. They're sending us home early. Congratulations. You moved the crisis down another week. Go home. Have a 4-day weekend. We're going to let staff and a few members in the Senate and a few members in the House write this big bill, and then you can take it or leave it next week. Gone is any semblance of regular order from this process. What we have is what the swamp always does. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this continuing resolution that does nothing but kick the can down the road. And I yield back to my colleague from Texas.
Reserve.
Mr. Speaker, the first step in solving a problem is to acknowledge that it exists. The other side of the aisle is having a problem with that because that's what this resolution does. It describes the problem. The second part of solving a problem is to look at what the source of the problem is. That's what this resolution does. The other side of the aisle is having a problem with that. In fact, today they opened the debate by simply complaining that this is a House resolution and not a House bill. But this is a House resolution full of facts, inconvenient facts to this administration. This administration, since the beginning, has passed 94 executive orders that have repealing border security measures that were in place. And that's attracted 9.3 million illegal immigrants to our borders. This is a problem that exists. The other side of the aisle needs to quit denying that it exists, and they need to quit trying to change the topic to Ukraine. The topic today is these two bills. First among them is the resolution that draws attention to the problem at the border and lists specifically the things that this president could do to fix it. And with that, I yield to. I thank my colleague from Texas. Today we're voting on a resolution that will bring forward reauthorization of a program that's been abused for decades, the FISA 702 surveillance program. Before we vote on that program, though, this resolution that we're voting on now prescribes that we will bring forward an amendment to require warrants if you want to spy on Americans, if you want to use this database as a backdoor to look at the privacy, the private information of Americans, you would need a warrant if this amendment passes. Now, there's some people who say, oh, getting a warrant is too hard. It'll slow us down. You'll put America in danger. Listen, I've been in the SCIF, the classified area where they're supposed to tell us the problems with requiring a warrant, and they never have told us a single example of where getting a warrant would be a problem to national security. In fact, we've got a provision in the warrant amendment that says in exigent circumstances, you can skip that step. You'll hear today that, oh, everything's fine. We don't need the warrant amendment. We've got 53 reforms in this package. Here's the problem with those reforms. We rely on the same people that abused the system to enforce those reforms. And they still don't go to the constitutional level that is required in this country. Who doesn't trust those 53 reforms? Congress doesn't trust those 53 reforms. The authors of this bill, you know how I know? Because they put an exemption, 2 exemptions for themselves in this bill. That's right. If the FBI is going to use 702 FISA to spy on congressmen, they have to tell Congress. They even have to get permission from the congressman they're spying on if they say it's for the congressman's own good. Why do we have a provision in there that exempts congressmen but not all of America? Americans deserve the protections that are enshrined in the Constitution. Nothing less should pass this House. This is an enormous database. They're going to tell you, oh, we're just looking at intelligence that was gathered on foreigners. The problem is they're collecting this intelligence in the United States, using service providers in the United States, using internet connections in the United States. They collect a lot of stuff here. Do you think the NSA employee who did a FISA search on a Tinder date was looking for information about Hamas? No. There's all kinds of information in there, and that's why it's being abused. That's why we need the warrant provision. I urge folks to vote for this rule so that you can vote for the warrant provision amendment, and if that amendment doesn't pass, you shouldn't vote to reauthorize FISA. And with that, I yield back.
Reserve.
We're here today to pass a rule that will bring up a program for a vote that's been abused hundreds of thousands of times. Abused by the FBI's own standards, hundreds of thousands of times. But every time they've used it, they've actually abused it because they have not followed the constitutional requirement in the 4th Amendment. Today, if we pass this rule, we'll have votes on 6 different amendments. 3 of these amendments will expand the program, and 3 of these amendments will constrain the program. There are people who say, oh, this bill is fine as is, doesn't need any amendments. But here's the problem with that. If we believed that, why would we put exemptions for Congress in this bill? There are exemptions for Congress in the base bill of 702. What do they do? They say that if a congressman is going to have their privacy violated with the 702 program by the FBI has to notify Congress. It goes on to say in this bill that if the FBI is going to tell us that they're doing it for our own good, they have to get permission from the congressman whose privacy is going to be violated. Why does that only apply to members of this body? The Constitution provides that we should give these protections to everybody. The Constitution requires a warrant. That's one of the amendments that will be offered here today. In fact, the chairman and the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction for this legislation, which is the committee that many years ago created the 702 program. The chairman and ranking member have said that if the warrant provision is not adopted, they will not vote to renew this program. And I applaud them for taking that stand. Because the Fourth Amendment to our Constitution says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched or the person or things to be seized. The FISA 702 program is clearly in violation of the Fourth Amendment. We can fix it for the most part with one amendment. There will still be other defects in the FISA program. And I will just close by saying this. America is watching us today. They are going to watch the results of this vote. What will we do here today? Are we going to carve out exemptions for Congress? Are we going to protect ourselves but not the American people? Or are we going to provide them with the protections that our founding fathers enshrined in our Constitution? We swore an oath to do that when we took these offices as legislators, and we need to follow that oath. And that's why I urge adoption of this rule. I urge people to vote for the warrant amendment, and I urge people not to vote for the final bill if the protections of the warrant amendment are not there. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question on the resolution.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, now I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to a valuable member of the Committee on Rules, Mr. Massey of Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 2 minutes.
I truly thank the chairman for yielding me time because he knows I'm slightly opposed to the rule, so he's very gracious. I'm concerned that the speaker's cut a deal with the Democrats to fund foreign wars rather than to secure our border. But what I want to talk about today is process. The bill that will come out of the House after all of this is a bill that began as H.R. 815 to expand the eligibility for veterans to receive reimbursements for their emergency care. How did a bill that was intended for veterans that came out of the House become a bill that may bring us to the brink of war at least 3 places on the globe by sending $100 billion to military contractors? Well, it started in the House, and then the Senate took it and stripped every word from the bill. Why did they do this? Were they trying to get around the origination clause in the Constitution? Were they trying to shortcut some process? It's one of those things. But what we've got now is a collection of bills, and I do appreciate that we get individual votes on 4 of these bills. But they include $100 billion. They don't include securing our border. They include a bill called the Repo Act, which could call into question the value of our Treasury bills when we go out to auction those next, if we are going to confiscate Treasury bills that we sold to other countries. It also includes a bill that allows the president to ban websites based on his discretion. I'm concerned about that. This bill, H.R. 815, started as a veterans bill, went to the Senate, got gutted, became the foreign aid package bill. Now here in the House, we're going to vote on 4 separate titles, but we're going to package them back as amendments to that H.R. 815. So we're actually going to send it back to the Senate as the bill they sent to us, which is the gutted veterans bill. I know this is all confusing, but why is this all being done this way? Some will say to force the Senate's hand, but really what it's going to do is jam the Senate, the conservatives in the Senate who would like to have a more fulsome debate. And with that, I am opposed to the rule, and I thank the chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of my amendment, which simply recognizes that the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Our Constitution establishes a very clear framework for making treaties by the executive and with the advice and consent of the Senate. But our Constitution also establishes a clear framework for making laws that affect our domestic affairs. If any provisions of a treaty are to have legal bearing on United States citizens, those provisions must pass both the United States House of Representatives and the Senate and be presented to the President, as all federal laws must. Treaties don't override our constitutional process for making law. Presidents can't make U.S. law by agreeing to new terms in an international treaty. Every law that American citizens live under must pass the House and the Senate. My colleagues have eloquently made the point that a president can't enter into a treaty without advice and consent of the Senate, and in doing so, they are standing up for the sovereignty of American citizens. But they are requiring the Senate to be that portion of the legislative branch that decides what laws will bear on citizens, depending on what the treaty is. My amendment here is very simple. It says that if a treaty has a law in it that has the bearing on United States citizens, on our domestic activities, then it has to follow the lawmaking process of the Constitution. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to this amendment because it is within the president's authority to negotiate treaties and agreements without Senate ratification. While inserting findings clarifying the role of Congress in ratifying treaties would be entirely appropriate for a treaty under recognition. The draft pandemic agreement is not a treaty. As I've previously stated, the United States President has the option of ascending to a treaty agreement through executive action alone, without the advice or consent of the Senate. And over 90% of all U.S. international legal agreements have been approved via executive action rather than normal or formal Senate approval. These findings insinuate that the Biden-Harris administration is attempting to sidestep the Senate in these pandemic agreement negotiations. This is absolutely 100% wrong. And it is for these reasons that I urge all of my colleagues to oppose this amendment. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
You know, the bulk of my speech in support of my amendment actually doesn't come from me. It's going to come from Alexander Hamilton, who described in Federalist 75 the treaty-making powers of the executive. He states, its objects are contracts with foreign nations, which have the force of law, but derive it from the obligations of good faith. And this is the most important part. They are not rules prescribed by the sovereign to the subject, but agreements between sovereign and sovereign. The power in question seems therefore to form a distinct department and to belong properly neither to the legislative nor the executive. The qualities elsewhere detailed as indispensable in the management of foreign negotiations point out the executive as the most fit agent in those transactions, while the vast importance of the trust and the operation of treaties as laws plead strongly for the participation of the whole or a portion of the legislative body in the office of making them. So what's he saying here? He's saying you can't make laws, domestic laws, using a treaty. Treaties can't bind the United States to declare war. Treaties can't raise taxes. Treaties can't create new laws for us. And the United States should not take part in international institutions that erode our sovereignty. Congress should not legitimize blatantly unconstitutional notions that agreements that come out of these institutions supersede the Constitution of the United States. So let me just close by saying this. Do we believe that the Senate itself and the President, without consulting the House, could implement a vaccine mandate by merely calling it a treaty and finding another sovereign party to enter into with? I do not. Do we believe that they could implement or impose social distancing on U.S. citizens by calling it a treaty and finding another sovereign to enter into an agreement with? I do not. They have to come to the House. Let's take the example of gun control. Do we think they could impose gun control on U.S. citizens in a treaty? By the way, this is not a hypothetical. In a treaty with the United Nations and some other sovereign countries, merely with the advice and consent of the Senate. That would take 2/3 or 67 votes in the Senate, but it would completely leave out the House of Representatives. No, they cannot do that. That is outside of our Constitution. We are guaranteed a Republican form of government with a legislature that makes the laws that bear on citizens. So I'll close with this most important part of my amendment, which says, if any provisions of a treaty are to have legal bearing on United States citizens, those provisions must pass both the House of Representatives and the Senate and be presented to the President, as all federal laws must. So I urge adoption of my amendment, and I support the underlying bill as well, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.
Madam Speaker, we are told today that we are going to vote on a continuing resolution with another bright, shiny object attached to it. I feel like this legislation is insincere and unserious. Now, why is it unserious? Well, it's unserious because we're cramming all government spending into one bill, and instead of deciding what to spend on, we're saying, well, let's just spend at least as much as we spent last year and not worry about running any of these bills through committee or debating how much we should spend on things. It's also unserious because we've spent 2 years uncovering deficiencies in our government. We've been stonewalled by the FBI and the DOJ. That familiar refrain, oh, Mr. Congressman, that's the subject of an ongoing investigation, and it's our longstanding policy not to comment on that. Well, you could say that in a press release, but they shouldn't be saying it to Congress. But they get away with it because we don't cut their spending every time they do that to us. If we would withhold the ink cartridge for one printer at the FBI, they would come to heel. Yet we're not going to do that in this bill, this continuing resolution. It's just unserious. It's also very insincere. It's an insult to the American people. It's an insult to their intelligence to bring this bill to the floor because it sets up a fake fight that we all know here is fake. Somebody come down here and tell me it's not fake. You all know it's fake. And here's what's even more insincere about it. The compromise has already been reached in a smoke-filled back room here. They already know what we're going to do. It's going to be a clean CR when we get to September 30th. And what is the deal they've reached? It's the same deal they reach every year. We'll let you spend a few billion dollars more if you'll let us spend a few $billion more. When in fact what we should be doing is correcting this country's course. We are on a course to financial ruin. And I ask my colleagues, when history looks back, how will it judge you for what you do today on this vote? Will it say, oh, well, this is a person who was unserious and insincere, and instead of making the tough arguments and having the tough discussions with their voters, decided to go along to get along on the path to financial ruin? Or will you be one of the people who stands up and says, this is unsustainable, we must stop it, I will not engage in a fake fight, I will not be part of this political theater, and will you stand your ground? Will you be one of those people? I hope you will. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the continuing resolution with the fake shiny object attached to it, and I yield back.